The story I want to focus on particularly is the story of the prodigal son, which is, in the traditional telling, this wonderful tale of redemption, of a rebellious young guy who goes off and does some very naughty things in a long way away and spends money and drinks and does other things. And then, gets very poor and he decides, okay, I'll go back, but my father's going to really hate me. And his father doesn't. He goes out to meet him and everything's brilliant and fine and there's restoration. Everyone's read the Henri Nouwen book, right? Return of the Prodigal Son, that's lovely. Now, I'm not saying that reading is wrong. This is a parable, it supports multiple meanings within it. And I want to tell a kind of a dark, inverted reading of that parable, whereby I think there is a suggestion within it that actually the parable is a tragedy. And it's a tragedy because it is a failed pirate story. Now, Luke's original version begins, there was once a man who had two sons. So that really, the protagonist of the story is the father, not the two sons. But if you imagine retelling the story from the son's perspective, he's there, he's working away on his father's compound, and the place seems pretty rich. There's wealth here. They live a good life. And I think there's a sense of grievance, really. The two brothers aren't really particularly happy, and the son, he wants to go and do something else. He wants to bust out of this place. He wants to go and see the world. So he commits that terrible thing of asking for his father for the wealth, and off he goes. Like every other student did going to college, and has a great time and spends time and sees all this stuff, and wow, it's fantastic, He's broken out of there. And he ends up in a place of need. I mean, there's starvation and there's hunger, and he thinks, you know what? My dad's money could do good here. If only my dad could come and work here, we could help these people. But he gets very hungry, and the turn point of the story is where he's, there in amongst the pigs, kind of craving after the food that they get. He says, look, I cannot go back as a son, and I would not want to do that. I don't want to go back to that place of privilege. But to go back as an honest laborer, okay, to go back and do honest labor, at least I can pay my own way. And he heads back to his father, who has not gone out looking for him. And that's the interesting thing. If you compare the parables around that, you've got the parable of the lost coin, where the woman empties the entire house to look for this coin, does all this huge active stuff. And then there's the parable of the lost sheep, where he leaves the 99 and goes way off to find the one. Well, the father, he kind of looks around a bit. He doesn't really go and try and find the son. But so the son goes back, and the ring goes back on his finger, and the cloak goes back on, and all the trappings of comfort and power and status return to him. And he says, I was alive, but now I am dead again. Because the tragedy of the prodigal son story is nothing changes. The empire is conserved. And the father learns nothing. And that's perhaps why the older son is so irritated. It's like, you were meant to be doing this for both of us. You're meant to be busting out of here, But nothing changes at all. Now, a parallel story which Luke must have known. He must have known because he was a Greek. It's the story of the Odyssey. Anyone know well the story of the Odyssey? Oh, shh. You're not allowed to speak. No. So the basic story of the Odyssey is we've got Odysseus who's fought the Trojan War for many, many years, and he wants to get back home. Except he annoys one of the gods, and the gods thwart his journey back home. Okay? He just cannot get back to Ithaca. And his wife is waiting in Ithaca, and he cannot get back home. And instead of getting back home, he has all these trials, and he goes off to these islands and is tempted by these beautiful women, and there's all these other fights and all the rest of it. And Athena comes to Odysseus' son, Telemachus. And Telemachus in Greek means far from war. So he's immediately been distanced in the narrative from his father as a different person. And Athena, who is almost like the anti-god, she's the god of reason, of philosophy, of just war, of logical thought, She's the kind of rational one, says, you need to go out and look for your dad. So he goes on this journey, searches all round for him, and he does eventually find Odysseus. And where does he find him? Well, he finds him back on Ithaca, stuck out, living with this pig herder, already on the island, where he could have just walked home. And he's like, what stopped you from coming home? Why didn't you come home? So what Telemachus does is to challenge his father to basically make that final step and to make that change and to come home. Now, interestingly, the turning point of that story, of the Odyssey, is again with this character in amongst pigs, in amongst these animals. And I'll throw it out as a hypothesis. Who knows? But in that, there's perhaps a hint of the turn in the beginnings of the Christian story with God coming to earth amongst the animals, and being born into a manger. Okay? Now, the key question about the Odyssey is, what was really stopping Odysseus from coming home? Because he would spout on about the gods are stopping him, and, I just cannot get back home. There's this big other who's stopping me moving. And in fact, not just stopping me moving, but I've got to fight all the time and then be tempted by beautiful women. Well, perhaps actually he was stopping himself from going home. And it was only Telemachus kind of pushes that to one side, with Athena as this kind of anti-god and says, you know what, forget about those big others. You've just simply got to make that step to come home. Perhaps that was what needed to happen. Now, going back to the prodigal son and then the story of Jesus, what my contention is, and I'll end with this and then get back to the radical theology part, is that Jesus turns the tragedy of the prodigal son and completes it as a triumph. He leaves his wealthy and enclosed home in heaven, comes down to earth, finds suffering, finds so much need, and is perhaps simply tempted to go back and leave nothing changed at all. But he totally refuses to do that. He refuses simply to return back home, be welcomed back in, put back on those, the ring and the cloak and everything, just be hunky-dory, just as it was before, because he does not want the empire to remain unchanged. And in the death of Jesus, what we're seeing again is that challenge to the big other. Because, we read that cry on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me, And perhaps just with a change of intonation, why have you forsaken me? What's your problem? Why have you forsaken me? Why are you so angry about this? Why are you angry that I'm here? This is like some kind of obsessive, compulsive God up there who just purity and everything, and you can't have anything dirty, whatever. Like, why did you forsake me? What's your problem? Just get over it. And rather than returning back to heaven, Jesus busts open heaven. He says, you know what? You're going to have to come back down here. And the temple curtain ripped open, and out we come.